So welcome everyone. It's so exciting to see everyone here and seeing the number of people that we have. This is the Green Zoning in Massachusetts webinar by the Massachusetts Climate Action Network. My name is Rose Schicker-Haynes. I am the Quaker Voluntary Service Fellow at Massachusetts Climate Action Network this year. And again, I'm so excited to see everyone here. Some people that I know before, but a lot of new faces, which is awesome. So I am first going to throw it to Sarah, our executive director, who's going to just talk a little bit about MCAN and what we do.
Great, thank you, Rose. Can everybody hear me? Thumbs up. Yes, fabulous. Again, it's really wonderful to see everybody here tonight. I think we have over or approaching 200 folks on the call. That's wonderful for this really interesting topic, green zoning. And just for those of you who are not as familiar with MCAN as others, we were founded in 2000. We are an advocacy organization. We are about people, supporting people to make change at the local level. And then inviting and working with local level advocates to affect change statewide. We have many different kinds of campaigns related to the retrofitting of affordable housing, net zero stretch codes, and with a big emphasis on municipal light plant advocacy around making them more transparent and contributors to a clean and renewable energy future. So with that, I just want to express my profound thanks to Rose, our moderator for tonight. She is our QVS fellow, Quaker Voluntary Service Fellow, and she is with MCAN through the end of next summer. And her primary role is to connect with chapters, to support our chapters in terms of assistance they need, peer-to-peer learning. And for those of you who are in an MCAN chapter, just so everybody knows, we have over 60 of chapters around the state, volunteers, passionate, committed advocates like many of you, all of you, and we have many of you on this call tonight from Somerville, from Worcester, Marblehead. So pay attention to who is showing up in the chat, and you'll be surprised by the geographic diversity that is on the call tonight. So with that, I will turn it over to Rose, who will set some of the ways that we're going to handle this webinar this evening. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So like Sarah said, I am kind of working as a chapter liaison, and I just wanted to track at the very beginning that this webinar could not have happened without our chapters. It came out of ideas that chapters had and a desire for more conversation about green zoning. And also specifically, I really have to extend special thanks to Larry Yu and Lee Mounier of the Climate Coalition Somerville, who really helped make this webinar come together. So big thanks to them. They were like an integral part of the process. And thanks to our chapter. And also in chat, people are kind of introducing themselves, saying where they are, which is really great to see kind of the diversity and kind of geographics and what kind of groups people are affiliated with. I wish we had time to introduce each other in person. Unfortunately, we have only an hour and a lot of people, but I think that's really great to get to know each other through the chat. So the goal of this evening is to do peer-to-peer sharing around innovations in green zoning in Massachusetts and then also beyond. One thing to note about MCAN, our theory of change is very much focused around the idea that progressive policies on the local level are really important and really where change happens. So we're looking a lot at what individual cities and individual towns can do, because we see that as a model for what can happen statewide and maybe eventually nationwide. We see that as a place where grassroots advocates can really have a lot of power. So the outline for tonight, we have 4 amazing speakers in 3 amazing presentations. Our first speaker is going to be Dan Bartman, who's the senior planner for the City of Somerville's Office of Strategic Planning and Community Development. Then we're going to have Renee Scott and Tori Antonino, who are members of the community organization Green and Open Somerville. And then we're going to have Kathryn Wright, who's the program director for buildings at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, USDN. Each of these presentations will be about 10 minutes, and they'll really look at We're using Somerville a little bit as a case study in the beginning because they had a really progressive zoning overhaul recently, and kind of looking at that, and that from both the municipal level as well as the advocacy level, and then looking at models for Massachusetts' future in other states. And then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. As we mentioned, if you have questions throughout, feel free to drop them in the chat, but you can also hold on to them till the end, and we'll have a time specifically for questions. And then at the end, Sarah and I have a few words just to wrap things up. So without further ado, we'll hear from Dan Bartman, Senior Planner at the City of Somerville.
Thank you, Rose. So I guess the first place to start at is that I joined the city in 2012 with a specific task put forward to rewrite the city's zoning ordinance. Luckily, after only 7 years and 9 months, we were successful at doing that. But this was the first zoning ordinance rewrite in the past 30 years, so it was a big step for the city. Rose asked me to do a short introduction to what zoning actually is, because there's probably a lot of non-zoning aficionados on the call tonight. And then I cover what we did in our new zoning ordinance and the City of Somerville's climate change planning. Next slide, please. So as a very broad overview, zoning is any kind of law that divides a specific jurisdiction into zones or districts to regulate real property differently in each of those zones or districts. Real property itself is a designated portion of land and anything that humans do to that land. So if you put a building on top of the land, or an oil well underneath the land, infrastructure, all the vegetation that you put on your land, all of that is called real property. It's considered permanent improvements to the land. What authorizes the government to even regulate real property? In our constitutional law practice cases that have happened over time, we've determined that police power is the capacity of the state government to regulate behavior and enforce order to promote health, safety, morals, and general welfare of the population. That can also be said as the enactment and enforcement of laws, as practiced by the legislative and executive branches of the government. So the legislative branch writes the laws that are reflected in the police power, and the executive branch administers those same laws and executes the police power. So how do municipalities have the authority to do zoning if that power is vested in the state government? Is a question we always get. Next slide. And that really has to do go all the way back to 1922 to understand the origins of that power. In that era, the Department of Commerce under Herbert Hoover, sorry, I had to read the top of that document, put forward what's called the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. This was model state law language for states to enable their municipalities to adopt zoning regulations. And they had to do this by passing down their authority over the police power to municipalities. And by 1930, a version of the CISA was adopted by 35 state legislatures. So you can see how quickly after they first came up with this, that this progressed and spread across the country. Massachusetts' Enabling Act is called Chapter 40A, Section A. It's titled the Zoning Act. And as it relates to sustainability and resilience, we have to actually understand that Massachusetts MGL 40A is a disabling piece of legislation because of a clause that it holds that says no zoning ordinance or bylaw shall regulate or restrict the use of materials or methods of construction of structures regulated by the state building code. And this becomes the most controlling thing that we have to face when we're trying to address climate change, sustainability, resilience over time in a zoning law. That doesn't mean there's other avenues, but it is a specific limitation on what we can do in zoning. And every time you attempt to do something in zoning related to these topics, you have to question whether or not you're preempting the building code. As a recent example, next slide, was the city of Brookline. So I mentioned we cannot preempt the building code with anything that we do locally. And on November 19th, 2019, at a special town meeting, warrant Article 21 established a prohibition on new fossil fuel infrastructure in major construction. Many municipalities from across the Commonwealth were watching what was going on in Brookline because, for instance, Somerville wanted to do the exact same thing. So we were very interested in learning what the Attorney General's office that is required to review new laws passed at town meeting would think about this piece of legislation. And on July 21st in 2020, Maura Healey's office handed down a decision that said that warrant Article 21 conflicted with the laws or Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and that it itself was preempted by the state building code, the gas code, and a section of general law related to the provision of utility services. And so, as I said, the local law is not allowed to preempt the state building code. Those laws are at a higher level of jurisdiction, and they preempt the local law. So this was an example of learning where that line in the sand exists related to the state enabling legislation for zoning. Next slide. So switching this to Somerville, these documents here represent the planning efforts that we've put into understanding both our vulnerabilities in Somerville and how we might address climate change moving forward. The first one was a vulnerability assessment. I'm sorry, actually the first one was our greenhouse gas inventory, which determined that our two top sources of greenhouse gas produced in the city is actually by the stock of buildings that already exist, and automobiles. So those are the two main things that we could attempt to address if we wanted to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Also, our climate change vulnerability assessment followed on the heels of this greenhouse gas inventory and determined that our three primary vulnerabilities are related to storm surge flooding or sea level rise, precipitation-based flooding, and the urban heat island or increasing temperatures. Just as an example, the average number of days in Somerville when the study was done that for 90-degree days was 11 per year. And by 2050, it's estimated that could increase if we do not take drastic measures around the world, that could increase to all 90 days of summer being above 90 degrees in temperature. So you can see how the urban heat would be a very large concern. So Somerville Climate Forward was written after these preliminary studies were done to figure out what we needed to do and laid out a plan. And in that was a number of zoning related items. And I'm going to cover a couple of them that we were able to accomplish in the zoning overhaul. Not all of our work is done. We wish to do more, but like I said, a lot of this is learning about how we can fit things in without preempting the building code. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about 5 zoning tools. Those are parking requirements, landscape standards, bonuses for sustainable buildings, submittal requirements, and permit conditions. And 2 of these are really about administration. That's number 4 and 5. And the first 3 are about what we were able to accomplish in our zoning ordinance. Next slide. So if you're not prepared to talk about changing how we regulate parking and zoning, you're not ready to talk about addressing climate change. Perhaps that's a personal opinion, but I think many of us here realize in our greenhouse gas inventory, I highlighted how big a problem that automobiles can be, especially if they have internal combustion engines. So the thing to take away from what I'm going to point out here, parking is such a huge topic, we could do a whole webinar just about that, is that free parking spaces are the #1 determinant on whether or not people actually own a car and use that car. And that means that we could probably start thinking about each minimum parking space required by zoning as being 4.6 metric tons of CO2 per year. So if you go and look at your zoning ordinance and think about how many parking spaces are required for each dwelling unit or per 1,000 square feet of commercial space, multiply that number of parking spaces by this metric tons per CO2, and that's really what you're causing to come into existence through minimum parking requirements. These 2 books that you see here, I really suggest reading them yourselves. It is probably represents 30 or 40 years of research by this gentleman named Donald Shoup from California. He has a 3-point plan for addressing parking in cities, which is abolish minimum parking requirements, charge a market rate price for parking on street and invest all that revenue in transportation improvements so we can get around better than we do today. None of that is specifically related to climate change, but if you add in the fact that we'll reduce greenhouse gas emissions just by doing all of the things he recommends, you can see how this all just starts stacking up and creating mutual benefits. Next slide. Oh wait, I should bring up that what we did in Somerville was, for about 80% of the city, we repealed minimum parking requirements and actually instituted a parking maximum if you're in walking distance to transit. So all of our new green line stations are 2 red line stations, the orange line, the 2 orange line stations. If you're in a half mile of those places, there's actually a parking maximum. So we know the maximum amount of metric tons of CO2 that new development could produce based on that parking maximum, rather than the minimum that we'll create, which is a nice way to flip that on its head. Next slide. The second zoning tool that we used was a number of changes to our landscape standards. So just in the section that says how you can plant things and how landscape is created, we said that all exposed earth must be landscaped if it's not covered by buildings or impermeable surfaces. 50% plantings have to create 50% coverage of that earth area at the time of planting. Sometimes this results just naturally, there's an amount of die-off, across the initial planting to the next planting season. So we want to make sure that there's at least 50% coverage going in. And then we establish quality standards for trees, soil, mulch, all kinds of the various features that add up to make a landscape. We also created a environmental sustainability performance standard for that vegetation. So this is a metric that we calibrated and specifically adapted for Somerville that had previously been adopted in the city of Seattle, in Washington state, and also in Washington, D.C., after successful implementations were witnessed in European cities. So those are called the green factor in Seattle and the green area ratio in Washington, D.C. This replaces a previous, like a generic landscape standard that you might see in conventional zoning ordinances that just say 30% of a lot must be landscaped. And we all know that grass is a landscape and can meet that standard fairly easily. This instead awards points for layered landscapes by giving certain points for trees, certain points for bushes, certain points for ground covers, and then even points for the dirt underneath those plants. And none of them add up to the full coverage that they actually provide, which means you have to layer things to actually earn full credit. And then finally, we created very robust street tree planting standards. This does not apply to any streets that are already managed by the city. So all of our existing public rights of way, we do street tree planting ourselves. This is for developer produced new streets. So you have to plant large tree species. That's defined as any tree that is capable of growing to 30 feet or taller at maturity based off of its genetic DNA. Each tree requires 1,000 cubic feet of soil volume area underneath that tree. And you'll notice the graphic in the bottom right corner here has what look like supports underneath those trees. That's an example suspended pavement system that prevents the dirt that's put in that volume area from being compacted. Compacted dirt can be just as equivalent as concrete when it comes to tree roots. And it's incredibly important to make sure that the root system of a tree is successful if you actually want to have a 30-foot tall tree at maturity. We require proper street tree spacing. The desire is to try and create an immediate condition of let's say an alley of trees down the street, and when they're small, the desires tend to be to plant them too close to each other than what they would need to be when they grow to full maturity. So if we're requiring them to be a species that would grow to 30 feet tall, requiring them to have the dirt so that they can actually grow to 30 feet tall, we need to make sure that their canopies can spread out to the height or the breadth that they would get to at 30 feet in height. So that's why we have spacing requirements. And then we do require the soil area, because of how important it is for tree growth, to be protected with a small fence. So any of those, for instance, you've seen tree well protection in the Back Bay might be a good example. So that's required for all new streets that are built in Somerville, developer built streets in Somerville. Next slide. And then we also have a number of bonus-based sustainability requirements for buildings. The first one is that at certain size thresholds, we do mandate LEED certifiable buildings. If your building is 25,000 square feet or more, you have to be LEED Gold certifiable. If you're 50,000 square feet or more, you have to be LEED Platinum certifiable. This is construed as a bonus because you can build a 24,999 square foot building by right and not have cannot be proven at the time that you get a permit through zoning. It can only be awarded at the end of the process once a building is even occupied. So you really need to highlight this as certifiable and then make sure that they prove that they're working towards certification through process, which I talk about later. Second is density bonuses. I have one of these highlighted in the bottom right here, gross floor area per dwelling unit. So the same way you might require lot area per dwelling unit, we require building area per dwelling unit. And we award, using this metric here, more density if you provide a net zero building. And net zero buildings are defined as any building that has no on-site combustion for HVAC system operation and cooking equipment, and is certifiable as zero carbon or higher from the International Living Future Institute, or FIAS Plus from the Passive House Institute US, or Passive House Institute, which is the international version of that same organization. We do exempt eating and drinking establishments so that our restaurants can have gas-fired kitchens, but that is the only exemption that we make. And then lastly, we have some optional overlay districts that trade things such as unlimited density and unlimited building height in exchange for, among others, buildings that meet the net zero definition or LEED Platinum certifiable. That's regardless of any kind of density bonus or any kind of building size threshold. So all buildings in an overlay district have to meet one of those two criteria if you're utilizing the overlay district and its unlimited height and unlimited density. So these are all of our sustainable building criteria is based into a bonus system that rewards these buildings for being more sustainable. Next slide. Move into the administrative aspects of what we were able to do in zoning. So anytime somebody submits for a building that requires site plan approval, they have to fill out what's called the Sustainable and Resilient Buildings Questionnaire. It asks questions related to building sustainability and resilience that it makes our developers at least think about these issues in answering these questions. Many times development teams aren't looking at sustainability, and this form forces them to address these questions, ask them very specific questions about the energy use intensity of the building. So they're not able to just like make up answers. Also, this is part of the public record and reviewed by the planning board or other boards that handle site plan approval. So they can call out the developer if they're not delivering on these things, but they've answered a question differently, for instance. We do make them fill out a LEED compliance narrative and checklist. It's a document that's written by a LEED certified professional that explains how they intend to earn their LEED credits. And then a copy of the LEED checklist for the appropriate certification level. This is only required if you are doing the LEED certification, if you're required to do the LEED certification. And then the same thing for net zero. So it's a document written by the applicant explaining how they the proposed building will achieve the specific certification necessary to meet that definition, which I read previously, and then requires registration paperwork from the certification agency. So you have to apply with FIAS, the Passive House Institute US, or Passive House Institute, or the Living Building Future Institute, and give us a copy of your registration so that we know that you're moving in the right direction to earn that density bonus. And then the next slide, and actually last slide, is related to permit conditions, which actually advance the continuing certifiability of any building that's either doing the LEED path or the net zero path. Again, because you can't prove certification till the very end of the process, so we want to make sure they're continuing down the path towards certification. So an applicant has to updated LEED certifiability information prior to the building permit being issued, and again prior to the certificate of occupancy being issued. We also require the applicant to actually register the building with the US Green Building Council, who issues the LEED certification. And then they have to actually apply for LEED certification. Technically speaking, a building can fall short at the end and not actually achieve its LEED certification. That is very unexpected if they've gone through all of the steps necessary to get through the permit process here and continue to update their certification checklist and their narrative along the way. They should be on the right trajectory to actually get certification. Same thing with net zero. They have to submit the same documentation at building permit and certificate of occupancy. There are many things that we attempted to include in the zoning ordinance that are not covered here because we determined that they, at the time, would be a preemption of the state building code and that we needed to find other ways to do them. For instance, we wanted to include mandates for electric vehicle charging stations inside our parking garages. And it was determined that that was too close to requiring certain energy conduits and certain ways of constructing the power necessary to feed all of these electric vehicle charging stations, and that we would put ourselves in a high rate of susceptibility to having this overturned by the courts if we were to pursue adopting it. That, of course, doesn't mean that you can't adopt it, but you make yourself susceptible to having it repealed later on. We do continue to explore what we might be able to achieve in zoning and kind of understanding, becoming aware of what our limitations were, actually incentivize the city to get involved in the building code update process with the state, which many of you might have participated in yourselves or be aware of, in attempting to get net zero incorporated into the stretch code. So we became very much involved in that process just by learning what we could and couldn't do through zoning. I believe that might be my last slide.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dan. That was such a good overview of like such a complex issue and project. I really appreciate it. So next we're gonna have Renee Scott and Tori Antonino of Green and Open Somerville talk about a little more of the advocacy side.
Hi, thank you, Rose, and thank you to MCAN for having us. I'm Renee Scott from Green and Open Somerville, and I'm gonna, next slide, please. So I'm gonna mostly focus on the green part of green zoning, so actual natural areas. There are wonderful people working in town to get better energy efficiency in buildings and 100% renewable energy, but we found that the nature part of things tends to get forgotten. So we actually formed Green and Open Somerville, Tori and I did, in 2014. We are a community group that we started to try to improve and increase green spaces in the city. You can see from this map, we're very, very non-green. We have transitioned over the years to focus on ecological restoration and native plants, among many other things. Next slide, please. So we have a couple real main focuses. One is to try to keep artificial turf out of our grass fields, which is we've not succeeded in very well. But grass is certainly not super ecologically friendly. However, it's significantly cooler and you're not covering your ground in plastic. So that's been a focus of ours. Also bringing in native plants. We've been working on a native plant ordinance for a long time. I won't go into details about why they're so important, but they are incredibly important. So you can look up, Doug Tallamy has a couple wonderful books about why native plants are really the backbone of preserving our food systems. And also just trying to bring nature back for the animals that were here before we covered everything in concrete. Somerville is the most densely populated city. Maybe it's the second most densely populated. It's either first or second in Massachusetts. Out of cities of 75,000 or greater, it's second in the US. It's second only to New York City. So we're very, very populated and dense. And so it's just really hard to find green spaces. And we have not historically done a good job about setting those aside. Next slide, please. So our zoning advocacy began when the overhaul began, or I should say the overhaul began in 2012, and we were following it. And we realized that it wasn't quite as green as we wanted it. We were hoping for a lot more focus on bringing in native plants and green roofs. And so in 2017, we put together our dream team we have just an amazing group of people in town that are experts in a whole variety of things, from stormwater to green roofs to air quality to et cetera, et cetera. So we brought them together, and over a few months, we wrote out our wish list, and we called it the Somerville Green Standard. And you can see some of the things we were focusing on. Next slide, please. And then once we had the Green Standard, we shared it with our city councilors, and one in particular, who's been a real champion of environmental issues in town, was really taken with it, and she decided to try to help us get an audience with Dan. And so we did, and it wasn't hard. Dan's a very approachable person, so it wasn't hard, but she definitely got us in conversations with him. And so we started meeting with him fairly regularly for quite a while, and going through the Green Standard and seeing where the things that we wanted to see fit into zoning, and many of them did not. As Dan said in the very beginning, there are plenty of places that zoning does not, doesn't have, you can't put into zoning. So and one of the things we did focus on that Dan mentioned was the green score. A lot of what we were looking for in improving vegetation fell into the green score. So anytime someone was going to totally redo a building and redo the landscaping, that would come into effect. So one thing we also did was would run old projects that had already happened or didn't happen, but had been submitted to the city at some point, run them through the green score and see if they would have passed our standards. And we found many did not. I mean, I think some definitely did, but we were sort of surprised to see how many wouldn't. And so using those examples, we would then realize where we could tweak, what could we have required on that building to make it pass. And so that was a really helpful sort of hands-on way to do that. Next slide, please. So here's just an example of the green. You can see the green score on the left. And we also, one thing we got in towards the end was a requirement in an overlay district, a requirement for on buildings outside of mechanicals and amenity space, that they have to have either the rest of the space has to be 100% green roof or PV or a combination of both. So that was another thing we really pushed for. Next slide, please. So that was what we did. We really were blessed to have Dan with us. I would love to say you could hire him, but we don't want him to leave Somerville. So he was really wonderful, did a great job of explaining. So we'll be forever grateful for Dan for really taking us seriously. But what our recommendations for what you guys can do, I mean, I don't know how many of you are actually looking, where you are in your advocacy, but one thing you can do is just get people together who care and who are interested. And I bet you will find you have many people in your community that are really knowledgeable about things, ways to make things better. And we found that keeping people, so even if you didn't have, there are still people who care, even if they don't have a specific knowledge in things. So making sure you keep in touch with them, update them on email or Facebook or Twitter or whatever you're comfortable with, have meetings. We often will write letters to our elected officials or the local papers. We'll get our supporters to sign on or send their own. We've found being a troublemaker is actually, as long as you remain respectful and civil, but be a troublemaker. Don't necessarily take no for an answer, and keep pushing for things that feel like they're really important. Celebrate victories. And also the other thing is that we found there were so many people or other groups in our community that were aligned with, similar, not necessarily exactly doing what we were doing, but had similar interests. And so it was really nice to have, not only just have moral support from these other groups, but also you find that maybe they have a strength where you don't have it, and vice versa. So it's really good to reach out to other groups. Next slide, please. The other thing is get involved with your city. City Hall belongs to the people. So go meet the mayor and talk to people in planning. And whether you have city councilors or a select board or whatever your city, your town has, get to know the elected officials because they are there to represent you. And we found that for many of our elected officials, they wanted to know the right thing to do. They didn't necessarily know, but they were glad when people who had knowledge about things came to them and said, this is really important. So let's see. Yeah, so critical for us was having a planner willing to work with us and a city councilor who was willing to advocate for us. So the other things you can do is attend meetings, speak at public hearings, get your supporters to speak at public hearings, apply to serve on commissions and committees that have things that are aligned with interests of yours. If your city happens to be redoing zoning, at least in Somerville, it's a public process. Much of it is, and so go to any meetings you can and ask questions and give comments. And the last thing you can do is run for city government. It's a great way to get involved. Next slide, please. And so a couple things that we've been focusing on, through our advocacy, we got a pollinator garden, all native plants. And we've also been doing clean outs of black swallowwort, which is a terrible invasive that probably is in every town represented here tonight. So just getting involved and having people for an hour, just showing up and weeding out this invasive weed, or showing up and helping plant a garden is a really nice way to just meet your community members and stay involved. And I think that's it. There's gonna be one more slide. I can't remember. Oh, right, our final thoughts. So one thing we did find that zoning was an incredible effort on so many people's parts. And it's easy to feel like you didn't get everything you wanted, which is true. I mean, we didn't get everything we wanted, but we did get quite a bit. But it's really good to revisit as well. So, be familiar with it. Check in with developers because they may want to ask for waivers for things, but it's, let them know that you want them to set a really good example and be a leader among other developers who come in, and don't ask for a waiver, and follow the zoning as written. Recheck in with your experts and see if there are updates, because things are always changing, especially with energy related things. Like there are always updates that you can get. So make sure that you're aware and see if there are things that should be pushed for and amended. Sometimes the political mood might have changed. So times where we felt like we were sort of butting heads with counselors and maybe not getting what we wanted, there's a whole new group that was elected in, and maybe they'll be more aligned with what you want, and you can have some more, get another effort to make some changes. And then the last thing is just let people know you appreciate their hard work. So specifically, thank you, Dan. And just stay involved. It's once you get in, start, it feels maybe daunting to start, but once you start and you start showing up at meetings and you see the same, it becomes a community. You look over and see the same 4 or 5 people there at every meeting, and you realize this is pretty awesome. You start to make friends with people. So thank you.
Thank you, Renee. Can I just add one more? That was a great presentation. My name is Tori. And Renee touched on this. Just making allies is so important. And Larry Yu and Lee Mounier were pivotal in forming the Climate Coalition of Somerville. And so we had a bunch of, random groups. We had Fossil Free, and we had Mothers Out Front, and we had an MCAN chapter, and Our Revolution, and Indivisible Somerville. And once that group was formed, it was like, okay, we have our people, and we're going to be able to keep going, because it gets hard. It gets really hard. But if you have people like Renee and Larry and Lee, you have backup, and knowing you have backup, it just keeps you going. It keeps giving you fuel, and just keep going. Keep going. Thank you, Renee.
All right, thank you so much, both of you. And then we will go to our final presentation, which is by Kathryn Wright from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network.
So hi, everybody. My name is Kathryn. I'm coming to you from Cambridge, and I have been given the tall order of describing to you national trends in zoning in approximately 10 minutes. So I'm going to do my best. And just to start, you can go to the next slide. For those of you that are not familiar with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, or USDN for short, we're a peer network of over 220 cities and counties in the US and Canada committed to mitigating and adapting climate change and the clean energy transition. We also have a sister organization called the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance that has international cities working towards those same goals. And so just to flag, Somerville and the Sustainability Department of Somerville have been a longtime member of USDN, so I was thrilled to learn more about the zoning reforms today and to be part of this presentation. So just to start, on the next slide, building energy and building policy and thinking about zoning is a big part of what we do in the USDN. So we have members that are on various stages of their sustainability policy journey. So we have people who are in learning groups, which is really trying to get up to speed on emerging issues. So right now, one of our major pieces that we're discussing nationally is electrification and the natural gas transition. We're actually having a lot of dialogue with a cohort of communities in Massachusetts that are really trying to think through what does electrification look like and advancing electrification look like at a local level. And there are some potential zoning implications there, which I'll get to later in the presentation. We go all the way from let's learn together all the way up to special projects. So this year we had a series of communities that came together and did work around readiness. And so this is a particular type of ordinance and zoning provision that we're starting to see, where we're really trying to get existing buildings or new developments that are happening this year ready for future technology. So this includes solar ready, electric vehicle ready, and storage ready. So we actually had workshops focused on that as a emerging zoning policy. So that just kind of gives you a snapshot of how we all work together. And next slide, a question that I get all the time is, why does USDN spend so much time thinking about the built and natural environment? Well, just to start, this is a chart from the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. At this point, it's a few years old, but it shows that a lot of cities are committing to very aggressive climate targets, like 80% by 2050. And since this graphic was developed, the science has become more urgent. And so this 80% by 2050 goal, people are starting to get more aggressive. It's not just the vanguards anymore. It's becoming a more common refrain amongst our member communities. And so when you start to unpack, okay, well, how on earth do I do that? Some really interesting things start happening when you start thinking about what local governments actually have control over. So if you go to the next slide, this is where we really start to dig in into, okay, how do I achieve that target? So for the purposes of this graphic, when we're talking about energy efficiency, this particular piece of research was really thinking about the built environment. And it's the place where you'll notice that local governments have traditionally had the most control. And that is partly because some local governments do directly control their building codes, but also because of very traditional local government powers like zoning and development regulations. Zoning gives local governments the power to regulate development within their boundaries. That means things like aesthetics, but it also means things like how development occurs. So in Dan's presentation, he talked a lot about parking requirements. That's something that we've seen where zoning has really pushed the envelope for sustainability. It's also been used in the past for concepts like more compact development. And then in some places, Boston, Somerville, Cambridge, we have zoning with sustainable certifications like LEED certifiable requirements. So that's traditionally what we've seen. And a part of the reason for all the action there is just because this is an area where local governments and localities really can do something. And what I'll talk about with most of the rest of the presentation is like, what are we doing beyond that? So we're really starting to see that emerge. So if you go to the next slide, because of everything I just mentioned about control over the built environment and like what can we actually do as local governments, there was sort of a big movement to better understand how we're performing towards our carbon goals. So we have about 35 cities across the country that worked really hard to adopt benchmarking ordinance. So that basically made existing buildings tell their local governments and the public, how are you using energy and how are you using water? And so after several years of doing this, in some places a decade, they were looking at those numbers and making projections and saying, hey, we're not going to make it. We need to change the way we're thinking about policy and like guarantee actions in new construction and guarantee actions in existing buildings. So before I start talking about what I'm seeing in new construction, I'm actually going to talk about existing buildings first, because the frameworks that are being set up there are what we're starting to see in the next generation of zoning policy. So you can go to the next slide. And this just illustrates what I was saying before. So I'll just point out quickly that not all of the cities are on track to meet their climate targets. So that's what the benchmarking data indicated. Some more have gotten on track with more aggressive policies like the one that I'm about to describe, but that's largely why you've started to see a lot more action of late. So if you go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about existing buildings. So we're seeing a couple of things here of cities that are really like, how can I guarantee carbon reductions in the built environment? So you have some cities like Philadelphia and Seattle. They're moving towards more prescriptive requirements. If they know buildings are underperforming, they're asking them to perform a series of retrofits. We also have people that are moving towards more performance-based standards. Right now, this includes New York City, DC, and St. Louis. So in New York City, what they're going to be asking buildings to do is to reduce their carbon emissions over time. And there'll be different carbon emissions targets based on your building use type. In DC and St. Louis, it's very similar, but it's based on energy usage and Energy Star score. So in both of these cases, they're trying to lock in performance and greenhouse gas reduction so they can get closer to that 80% by 2050 goal. When we start talking about new construction, we're really starting to see that same pressure. So typically, if you look at a city, a large amount of the emissions, much like Dan mentioned, are coming from transportation and existing buildings. Traditionally, new construction is a lower emitter, but it's really important to lock in your savings in new construction, because once that building is built, you're basically going to be digging yourself out of a hole. So it's really important to think about new construction and zoning and development. So if you go to the next slide, let's talk about codes. We've been dancing around the issue. So codes right now is how is nationally how we set standards for new construction and development. And there's been an increasing interest from local governments in influencing the code. As Dan mentioned, Somerville was part of a series of USDN members that were really pushing for improvements in the building code. And the reason that it's really important to have those improvements in the building code is if you have a stronger base codes, cities that really want to push the envelope have more standing to push for stretch codes or push for particular types of zoning provisions. So there's a really important push-pull that has to happen that we're interested in seeing as a national organization, where we have innovation going on at the local level that we try to push as proposals into the next code cycle. And then cities are also trying to use the code as the baseline for their innovation. So it's really important to realize that there's a dialogue going on here. And even if local governments in Massachusetts don't directly have control over a code, it's really important to stay engaged and keep pushing the envelope. And you'll really start to see that push and pull when I start going back to talk about technology readiness. So if you go to the next slide, as I mentioned, one thing that we're really seeing is local governments are pushing on trying to make buildings more ready for future clean energy technologies. And if you think about the history of a lot of the readiness provisions, you'll see that they operated on those two levels. Some were innovations that happened at local government that made it into the code, and then some are innovations that were tried to be put in the code, and then local governments have innovated anyway. So I'll take these one at a time. So electric vehicle readiness is something that a lot of our communities are working really hard on and have been able to adopt through zoning code. So what this means is that they're setting up requirements for parking and wiring for parking, so that in a world where everyone's driving an electric vehicle, it's much easier for commercial buildings and large residential developments to accommodate that. This was something that we tried to get into the 2021 code unsuccessfully, but it was those provisions were based on local government innovations. So for example, in Boston, when they go through the development review, there's actually a series of electric vehicle readiness requirements that they ask for developers to complete. There's a bunch of links in this deck, so when you get the deck, you can actually click through and see each of these examples. On the Solar Ready side, Solar Ready is something that has been in the code. It's been in the code since 2015, and it's an optional appendix that local governments can adopt or states can adopt. Because it's there, a lot of people have started innovating on what is in the code. So in Watertown, for example, through their zoning ordinance, they actually have a mandate. So it's not about just making a building ready for a future solar installation. In Watertown, what they've said is if you are a commercial building that's a new development, we are going to ask you to install solar proportional to your roof space. So that's actually going beyond the code and using the code as a baseline to push further. There's other emerging examples. So Storage Ready just made it into this past code. So that's an area where people are going to probably be able to innovate. And Electrification Ready was also something that was put forward into this code. So what does that mean? That basically meant preparing wiring for future electrification of heating technologies. So it's going to make it less expensive if someone decided to install a heat pump later down the road. Unfortunately, that didn't make it into the code, but there's already local governments that are already pushing the envelope on electrification. So when we think about how do we think about this comprehensively, if you go to the next slide, there's basically 3 frameworks through which people are trying to push the envelope for clean energy technologies and sustainability. So the first is incentivize. So we talked about Brookline and their ban, which was overturned by the Attorney General. Where I have seen cities be able to push on electrification is when they're using an incentive framework. So in Santa Monica, they have all electric construction that they encourage. There's 2 pathways for getting basically a new building approved. If you're all electric, they're happy. If you have fossil fuel use in your building, you actually have to perform 10% better than California's code, which is already very strict. So you can imagine how this would be a method of discouraging future fossil construction. So that's one method, is the incentivize method. We're going to incentivize the type of building that we want to see. There's prescriptive requirements, which are a lot like Somerville's Green Score. They're pushing towards something specific, a specific solution. And then we're also seeing that same framework of performance metrics that I mentioned are happening in New York, DC, and St. Louis at the zoning level. So in Vancouver, when a building is rezoned, and so that means they're either trying to switch uses, I'm residential, I want to be mixed use, or it's a major rehabilitation. Vancouver requires that you show that on a performance basis, you're net zero or near net zero, and they have specific energy and thermal comfort targets that your building has to show through modeling that it can meet. And we are starting to seeing that in the US. So building on, if you're familiar with some of the work that's going on in Boston, they had a flood overlay for resilience, and now they're trying to apply some of these concepts we've seen in Vancouver for carbon. So they have a net zero carbon overlay that has just gone into public process. So what does that mean? It means that buildings that are in that zoning area would have to demonstrate carbon reduction over that they would have a certain carbon performance target, and they'd have to model that before the building is approved, is roughly what Boston's going for. So that's really sort of pushing towards our end goal of 80 by 2050. And so that's an emerging policy. That's cutting edge. We have a lot of members across the country that are watching Boston because they think that this is possible because cities are allowed to reduce harm from buildings in other ways. So for example, you're allowed to regulate indoor air quality. And if you're also viewing carbon as a harm, this is potentially a way that this can move forward without conflicting with the building code. Massachusetts is not alone in this conundrum of local governments not being able to control code. So if this is a path forward, this is a way that I would expect a lot more of the country to go. So I hope that's at least painting a picture of the future and where things are going. You'll have the deck afterward, and there's a lot of links if you want to look at the language of how other places have pulled this off. And I hope that's helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathryn. I know that was a lot to cover in a short period of time, but that was really effectively covered. We don't have as much time for questions as I was kind of hoping. We've actually reached 8 p.m. But I don't know, Sarah, if you've been monitoring the chat and if there are particular questions you want to hold up in the short period of time we have.
Yes. Yes, thank you, Rose, and thank you to our speakers. That was really great. So there are 3 clusters of questions, and I will, people are more than willing to hop. If you have to leave, that's great, I understand, but let's perhaps spend, another 5 minutes because these are some really interesting questions. And so the first question is a question about Somerville. And specifically, have there been any landscaping studies to evaluate the impact, the indirect impact of reducing urban heat island effect on mitigating the energy use of buildings in Somerville? And so Dan, I think that would be in your wheelhouse.
So we have not yet completed like a review of the environmental services that every landscape element might contribute, and then kind of adjust our green score based on an index of what those services are how much services are provided by each thing. We did, I would say, reward large tree planting. Specifically because it is the most impactful for reducing urban heat island, reducing precipitation-based storm events, through slowing the storm itself through tree canopy, but also storage of the stormwater in the root and uncompacted dirt area. So we do think we are targeting specifically one of our primary vulnerabilities in the way that we have our point system set up, but the next phase is hopefully to do a calibration of this tool based off of trying to achieve specific environmental goals, which we have not gotten to yet. Renee brought up that we probably put about 40 landscape plans through a spreadsheet when we were developing the tool. To understand, these were things that we thought aesthetically looked good, or we, in investigating the landscape said that's a good ecological landscape. And then we put it through the system to see what it would score, and then made adjustments based on whether or not it was scoring good or bad based off of that. But that's kind of qualitative rather than quantitative. And we want to take it into the quantitative realm and make further adjustments.
Very interesting. And related to that, Dan, there's a question about which preferred tree species for planting. How did you make that determination? Was it based on optimal sequestration capacity, or was it based on heat tolerance, or sort of a set of different factors?
There was 4 different factors. Renee and Tori and I, with our Public Space and Urban Forestry division, actually worked together on an index for large and small tree species. I might forget the 4 measures that we used, but I think it was carbon sequestration, stormwater infiltration or storage, species habitat, and one other thing, and I don't remember what it was. Urban heat island reduction, maybe. I can't remember what the measure was that would use specifically, but we put those into an index, and then made relative scores for each measure, and then made an overall index, and the like 30 trees that popped up to the top out of the 200 that we allow to be planted in Somerville. Native might have been in that, one of the criteria in that, but it produced a list for us that were high value trees. We have, I think, between 20 and 30 high value large trees, and 2 or 3 small trees that are high value, specifically because of what they do for us. And we actually provide a bonus credit if you plant one of those trees as your large tree species. So for instance, a large tree might be worth 0.6 of the area that its canopy covers. If you pick one of those trees, it counts as 0.7. All of our bonus credits are a 1/10 of a point.
All right, that's very interesting. And just one more question about sort of the green infrastructure side of things. I know there's a person on the call from Cambridge who's been talking about the Cambridge situation in the chat. Were white roofs considered in Somerville's zoning overhaul?
Yeah, I didn't touch on that, but we took a measure from. So one of the things that Kathryn pointed out is that performance standards are one of the ways of accomplishing many of these things, which is something you can do in zoning because it doesn't tell you how to accomplish something; it tells you how it has to measure as the end result. So that doesn't preempt the building code. So we used a performance measure from LEED and adopted it in our base zoning for surface albedo, which is the amount of solar energy that's reflected by a surface. And then we adopted albedo requirements for roofs and pavement. So it doesn't necessarily mandate white roofs, but it mandates high albedo roof materials. So it could be a different color, but the material itself is designed to have a high albedo. So that's the way we get at the white roof concept, which is about reflecting sunlight. If anyone might have also noticed that almost every UPS truck has a white roof. They're brown trucks compared to white FedEx vans, but they're doing the same thing. Those are driving around all day reflecting sunlight back up into the off of the ground level. So
Right.
we addressed it in a kind of.
Okay. And Kathryn, I'm just going to, I have a few questions that are in your wheelhouse, and we'll start with two easy ones, and then I'll open up one for for all of our presenters, because it kind of gets at the heart of what MCAN and all of us are trying to do around using tools to create a better future. And so for Kathryn, could you explain for folks why the stretch code is called the stretch code? And then after that, talk about just briefly, what does storage ready mean?
Yeah, so the reason that it's called the stretch code is it's going above the requirements of sort of the national code and the code that's adopted by the state. So you often hear them called stretch or reach codes because you're doing something beyond what's required. And in Massachusetts, there's an option for communities to opt into the stretch code. But the stretch code can only be as good as what it's based off of. So if the state doesn't have a recent version of the building code, for instance, the one that just is about to be approved by DOE, the 2021 code has a 10% increase in energy efficiency, which is more than the past 3 or 4 code cycles. So if you're not working from that like new great code, your stretch isn't going to be as strong. So you always want as strong a base code as possible. So storage ready is very similar to some of the other pieces that I described, where you're really trying to have your home be ready to receive storage. The way it works in the code is actually paired with solar. So for instance, if you do a regular solar installation, sometimes the metering infrastructure isn't such that you can actually have a storage system. So you're usually setting yourself up from an electrical and a metering perspective to be able to take that storage system without needing to redo your wiring.
All right. Thank you, Kathryn. And sort of the really interesting question I found in the chat for all of our presenters is, how do we get people excited about zoning? So, what is the hook? What is the frame? How can we connect zoning to a better future and talk about it in a way that, as the person said in the chat, is not a snoozer? So I open that up to any of our presenters this evening.
For a while, we were giving pizza away at our events. Yeah, that's a hard one. Zoning's not something that everyday people want to talk about typically. And many of the conversations become very heated because it's about what you can do on your own property. So it's a complex conversation to have in the first place, and causes a lot of anxiety sometimes. So opening up that can of worms is something that should be very carefully figured out. But I've only found success when we've engaged the public. Any project where we wrote a code in isolation, not that that's happened many times, but when you present something as if it's fully baked and you didn't get any public input, you're doomed to failure. When you start the project from the beginning, listening to people and asking them questions and trying to figure out what they're trying to accomplish in their lives and in their city, that's how you write a successful zoning ordinance.
Kathryn or Renee, any thoughts about how to get people excited about zoning in your spheres?
I think, it is, I think unless you are a city planner or have studied it a lot, it's really hard to grasp. But I don't know, I think that, I don't know that it's exciting. And I don't know that you're going to get people excited, but when you realize it's an effective way to make the changes you're wanting, you kind of buckle down and start figuring it out. Like Dan said, I think the people that would get it, there's a small group of people that would go to these meetings for whatever reason, whatever their pet interest was. And they went because they realized, I don't think anyone was like, oh, this is so exciting. Yay, zoning. I mean, maybe Dan feels that way, but I think in general, I don't know that you're going to get that excitement to do it. You just it's an effective way to get change. I think that's what you have to say to people.
The way the city did it, the way Dan and the fellow city staff, laid out the zoning, they just had a lot of come and learn about it. What interests you? What what's your passion? And I think, like what Renee said, if once you figure out it's a vehicle to make progressive changes, it's like, well, what can we do? What can we get in there? Dan, we need a meeting. It's like it for me, that was so exciting. There was a lot of participation in the overlay and for this overhaul. The zoning it is a constant, a changing document with their improvements to be made, but I feel like Somerville knocked it out of the park in terms of public participation and making it exciting by having, meetings and asking questions about what interests the residents. So just thank you, Dan. Thank you.
That's really great. Yeah, that's really great, Tori. It is about creating a future that is greener, cooler, more breathable, and more equitable, which we didn't necessarily talk on the equity dimensions of zoning this evening, but it's all folded in together. And I think city planners, I have a degree in city planning, and it is interesting to make it appealing and to connect it to our daily lives. But in reality, when you think about the spatial organization of Somerville or Waltham, where I'm calling in from, zoning is very powerful. So I'm going to turn our final wrap-up comments back to Rose, and she has a few announcements to make.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for facilitating the Q&A. So as we didn't get to everyone's questions, but if you want to follow up, if you have questions about MCAN or our role, you can contact me or Sarah at the email shown below. You can also contact our speakers at these 3 emails in order of which they spoke. As we mentioned, this webinar came out of interest of our members. So if you have an idea for a follow-up webinar or something you'd really like to see, please let me or Sarah know. Also, as I mentioned before, I will be sending out the recording of this and the slide deck, and we'll be capturing the chat from this evening because we had a very engaged chat discussion. So I know some people came in the middle or might have people that weren't able to come who'd be interested. So I will send that out so that you can go back and watch or share it with other people. Yeah, and then my final note is just to say thank you. Thank you so much to our presenters who were so passionate and knowledgeable and curious. And also, I know that we asked you to cover a lot of topics in a very short period of time. So thank you so much. Thank you again to Larry and Lee, who really helped bring this all together from the Climate Coalition at Somerville. They made this happen. And thank you to all of you for coming, for staying a little later than planned, and for your interest and enthusiasm. So Sarah put a link in the chat if you want to donate to MCAN and support more events like this. Sarah, I don't know if you have more to say about that.
No, I don't. I am so appreciative for everyone's time, from the presenters and from all of us hanging on the call a little bit later than expected. It's really because of your support, your interest, your energy, and advocacy work that we can do events like this, and that our community of advocates remains so effective. And I forget, was it Tori that said, be a respectful troublemaker? And so I think I'd like to conclude our evening with those words. So thank you, Rose, for facilitating, and thank you all for being respectful troublemakers.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.